fading spectacles in its 8 decades of existence. Khrushchev's shoe-banging, Gaddafi's 2-hour ramblings about Switzerland, Ahmadinejad's Holocaust denials, but nothing quite prepared the world's diplomats for the sight of Donald Trump blaming a broken teleprompter for his inability to form coherent sentences, as if the presence or absence of scrolling text could make any difference to a man who speaks like someone translating their own thoughts from a language that doesn't exist. Here was the President of the United States standing before representatives of every nation on earth, opening his address by complaining about the escalator and making jokes about his wife's physical fitness, transforming what should have been a moment of international diplomacy into something resembling a drunk wedding toast delivered by an uncle everyone wishes had stayed home. The speech itself, and I use the word generously, as one might describe the noises made by farm animals as conversation, was a masterclass in how to humiliate your nation while genuinely believing you're demonstrating its greatness. Trump claimed to have ended 7 wars in 7 months, wars that most international observers hadn't realized were happening, including apparently a 36-year conflict that would have had to start before some of the countries involved even existed in their current form. He spoke of ending the war between Kosovo and Serbia, apparently unaware that this conflict ended in 1999, when he was still pretending to be a businessman rather than playing one on television. But the mathematics of mendacity reached its apex when he claimed that in 8 months he had secured $17 trillion in investment into the United States, compared to less than $1 trillion under Biden's entire 4 years. $17 trillion, more than 3/4 of America's entire GDP, more than the combined GDP of Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom, apparently materialized because Trump said so. Even the delegates from nations where reality is treated as a bourgeois concept looked uncomfortable at this level of fabrication. It's one thing to lie, it's another to lie so preposterously that you insult the intelligence of people who've sat through presentations by North Korean trade representatives. The climate change portion of the speech deserves special recognition as perhaps the most concentrated display of aggressive ignorance ever delivered from that podium. Trump, with the confidence of someone who thinks ice cubes disprove global warming, declared climate change the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, apparently forgetting he was standing in a building surrounded by water that's risen measurably since the UN's founding. He mocked the carbon footprint as a hoax made up by people with evil intentions, while boasting about clean, beautiful coal, a phrase that makes as much sense as dry, refreshing water. His evidence against climate science was that Obama flew in an airplane, as if the existence of air travel somehow negates atmospheric physics. By this logic, doctors who get sick prove medicine doesn't work, and Trump's multiple bankruptcies prove capitalism is a failure, though actually, that last one might have some merit. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the leader of the world's second-largest carbon emitter explained that wind turbines are pathetic and start to rust and rot, as if coal plants are immortal monuments that require no maintenance and produce nothing but prosperity and rainbow-scented emissions. The immigration rhetoric was precisely what you'd expect from a man who thinks compassion is a character flaw and cruelty is a leadership strategy. He stood there, in a building dedicated to international cooperation, in a city built by immigrants, in a nation that exists because of immigration, and declared that accepting refugees was destroying Western civilization. He cited prison statistics from European nations, 72% foreign nationals in Swiss prisons, without mentioning that Switzerland counts anyone without Swiss citizenship as foreign, including EU residents who've lived there for decades, or that the actual crime rate among immigrants is lower than among native-born citizens, or that his statistics were simply wrong. The description of Washington, D.C. as having transformed in 12 days from crime capital of America to a place where your wife can walk down the middle of the street with or without you and nothing's going to happen would be hilarious if it weren't so sinister. The vision of women walking down the middle of streets, not sidewalks apparently, but the middle of streets, as a metric of urban safety, reveals a mind that thinks about cities the way a child thinks about dinosaurs, as exciting fantasies with no connection to reality. The claim that he'd removed 1,700 career criminals from DC in 12 days means he was arresting 141 people per day, which would be impressive if it were true, terrifying if it were true and they were actually criminals, and typically Trumpian in that it's neither true nor even plausibly false. It's just sounds that emerge from his mouth like methane from a swamp. But perhaps the most revealing moment came when he complained about the United Nations itself, launching into a bizarre reminiscence about bidding to renovate the UN building decades ago, promising marble floors instead of terrazzo, mahogany instead of plastic, still bitter after all these years that his offer was rejected. Here is a man so fundamentally narcissistic that he cannot address the United Nations without making it about a real estate deal he lost in the 1990s. He stood at the podium where Churchill spoke, where Mandela spoke, where Kennedy spoke, and he talked about floor surfaces and cost overruns like a contractor padding an invoice. The threat to Brazil was delivered with the diplomatic finesse of a mafia protection racket. Brazil is doing poorly and will continue to do poorly. They can only do well when they're working with us. Without us, they will fail. He mentioned meeting Brazil's leader for 39 seconds in the hallway, claiming they had excellent chemistry in those 39 seconds, then immediately threatened his nation with destruction. This is diplomacy as understood by someone who learned about international relations from The Godfather, if The Godfather had been written by someone with traumatic brain injury. The section about Europe's green energy policies read like someone criticizing a diet while eating their fourth Big Mac of the day. Trump, whose understanding of energy policy extends to drill, baby, drill, warned European nations that wind farms were destroying their beautiful countryside while promoting coal, as if coal mines are known for their aesthetic enhancement of landscapes. He claimed Europe loses 175,000 people yearly to heat deaths because electricity is too expensive for air conditioning, a statistic he appears to have invented with the same creative process that gave us alternative facts and truth isn't truth. Throughout it all, the delegates sat in what can only be described as traumatized silence, the kind of frozen disbelief you see on faces at the scene of an accident. Here was the American president talking about clean, beautiful coal, claiming to have stopped water drugs, boasting about sinking Venezuelan boats with military force, and declaring that he's really good at predicting things because he had a best-selling hat that said Trump was right about everything. It was like watching someone have a psychological breakdown while insisting they're giving a TED talk. The conclusion, where he asked everyone to fight, fight, fight for freedom, while having just threatened multiple nations with economic destruction for disagreeing with him, was the perfect ending to this theater of the absurd. He spoke of cherishing qualities that have made each of our nations so special, immediately after explaining why most of those nations were failing because they didn't do what he said. He called for defending free speech while threatening Brazil for allowing criticism of Americans. He praised sovereignty while demanding other nations adopt his policies or face tariffs. What we witnessed wasn't a speech but a symptom, not diplomacy but dementia, not leadership but the loud, confused ramblings of a man who mistakes volume for virtue and confidence for competence. The United Nations has heard from dictators and democrats, from revolutionaries and reactionaries, from the brilliant and the banal, but it had never before hosted someone who combined the intellectual capacity of a concussed goldfish with the diplomatic skills of a bar fight and the oratorical elegance of a seizure. This was America presenting itself to the world not as a superpower, but as a supervised patient, not as a leader, but as a liability, not as a nation, but as a nightmare from which we're all trying to wake. The assembled diplomats will return to their capitals with tales of the day the American president stood before the world and proved beyond any reasonable doubt that democracy's greatest weakness is that it occasionally produces leaders who make autocracy look tempting by comparison. They witnessed history, the moment American exceptionalism finally meant something, though not what Americans think it means. It means exceptionally degraded, exceptionally delusional, and exceptionally dangerous to the concept that humans are capable of governing themselves. The teleprompter, it turns out, was working fine. It was the president that was broken. But unlike the teleprompter, nobody knows how to fix him. And unlike the escalator that stopped halfway up, he managed to make it all the way to the podium to deliver this masterpiece of diplomatic vandalism. The United Nations has survived world wars, cold wars, and countless crises. Whether it can survive Donald Trump remains to be seen. Though if his speech is any indication, the greater question is whether Donald Trump can survive Donald Trump, and whether America can survive being represented by someone who makes Caligula look stable and Nero look competent.